to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation, to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Good afternoon. I'm Kelly Darnell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Welcome to today's webinar, the Supreme Court Race-Conscious Admissions and the Campus Fallout. 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court heard cases challenging the use of race in admissions at Harvard, our nation's oldest private university, and also the University of North Carolina, our nation's largest public university. Over the past 50 years, we've used affirmative action to create access in higher education where those students were previously excluded. And as our campuses have become more diverse, the question of, are they genuinely inclusive? And that question still remains. Affirmative action has been challenged several times over the last almost 50 years, starting in 1978 and most recently in 2016. Whatever the court decides. What we know is that campus leaders are going to be required to discuss some very tough topics about race, because there are going to be communities on those campuses that from students to professors to parents who are going to have a difficult time with that decision. And so today, our question for today's webinar is, how can campuses have these conversations with respect and with the commitment to open inquiry and inclusion on a subject that is so personal to so many people? Our webinar today is hosted by BPC's Campus Free Expression Project and will be moderated by its director, Jackie Pfeffer-Merrill. Before I turn it over to Jackie, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Campus Free Expression Project, which was created in 2019 and as one component of our response to the stresses on our democracy. Our Campus Free Expression Project is housed within our BPC's Democracy Project, which also includes our elections project, as well as our American Congressional Exchange Project. Our ACE project is where we bring members of the Democratic and Republican parties on the House, congressmen and women, together, and we introduce them to each other's districts and they spend time. It's our way of helping those members get to know each other. We believe our work on our democracy projects are very important, but our Campus Free Expression Project is just as important, because we believe we need to prepare those civic leaders and that next generation of bipartisan leaders. And we thank our universities, and we appreciate partnering with universities who are helping us with that task. And before I turn it over, I'd just like to say thank you for joining us for this webinar. This is a very difficult subject for America, and I hope that BPC is the right place where we can have these challenging conversations, and we thank you for joining us. Jackie?
Thanks very much, Kelly. And thank you very much to our audience for tuning in today. So over the last year, there's been a lot of coverage about whether the Supreme Court would take these cases at all, or what the arguments would or should be made before the court, and then analyses of the oral arguments themselves 2 weeks ago before the court. Today, we're turning our focus from the Supreme Court back to college campuses across the nation where these cases are being discussed by students, by faculty, by staff, and campus leaders. As Kelly noted, these questions are deeply personal. Race is one of the most difficult topics that we can discuss. And yet these cases will force conversations about race on campuses and in the higher education sector more generally. The question for our expert panel today is, how is it that campuses can have these conversations where there are competing claims of justice and deeply personal and passionate emotions at stake? We are going to have opportunities through these cases to discuss the cases themselves, which are very important, but these cases are also opportunities for campuses to model how to have fraught conversations and thereby raise the bar for national discourse. Today, we'll hear from 4 panelists, and I'll introduce our experts very briefly, and their full bios are available on the event webpage. Andrew Tutt is a senior associate at Arnold and Porter in the appellate and Supreme Court area, and he works very closely with the Education Policy Group. He's argued before the Supreme Court, including very recently during the court's current term. Wanda Heading Grant is inaugural Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Carnegie Mellon University. Previously, she was the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Vermont. Matt Lopez is Associate Vice President for Enrollment Enterprise at Arizona State University. He has served as President of the Association of Chief Admissions Officers for Public Universities. And Fanta Ah is Vice President of Undergraduate Enrollment, Campus Life, and Inclusive Excellence at American University. She has been president of NAFSA, Association of International Education Professionals. So thank you all very much for our experts for joining us. Welcome all. We're going to have about 35 minutes of conversation amongst our panelists, but I invite all of you in the audience to ask questions or make comments about what you hear at any point during the conversation using our Twitter hashtag BPC Live or the chat function on YouTube and Facebook. So Andrew, I'd like to start with you to sort of set kind of the legal analysis of what we have before us at the Supreme Court. So can you just say in a very brief compass, what is the question before the court?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are 2 cases, one against Harvard University and one against the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And they each pose 2 questions. Both cases pose the question whether the court should overrule its earlier decisions in Grutter, Bakke, Fisher, and 1 and Fisher 2, holding that affirmative action is lawful in higher education college admissions. Each case also raises the question whether these universities are violating those decisions holdings by implementing affirmative action in a way that the court has held is impermissible. So that's really what the challenges are about.
And in her introduction, Kelly noted we have the oldest private and the oldest public before the court. And, of course, their rules for some things are very different for public universities than they are for private universities. So what's the difference in the cases for Harvard and for UNC Chapel Hill?
Yes, so the Constitution applies only to public universities, and that would be the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution's 14th Amendment. However, Title VI is a statute that applies to all universities that take federal money. This is that no university that receives federal money, and both of these universities do, may discriminate on the basis of race. In the past, the Supreme Court of the United States has treated Title VI as commensurate with the scope of the 14th Amendment, such that anything that would violate the 14th Amendment also violates Title VI. The court separated these cases and considered them separately so that Harvard now could potentially have a different ruling if the scope of Title VI is actually more stringent than the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So there is that possibility in the case, although I will note that the most likely reason that the cases were separated was not because of the statutory versus constitutional question, but because one of the justices was recused from being able to consider the Harvard case. Justice Jackson sat on the Harvard Board of Overseers and therefore was unable to hear the case. So she only sat and heard the North Carolina and Chapel Hill case.
And the arguments on October 31st went much longer than expected, I think close to 5 hours. And I listened in to the whole time, but I know that you, Andrew, listened in with a much more expert legal ear. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you and your colleagues are anticipating in the decisions.
Absolutely. And I only speak for myself here, not for Arnold and Porter, but the justices appear likely to hold that Harvard and UNC's affirmative action programs violate Title VI and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The question that remains after oral argument will be the breadth of the court's decision. Some justices appear inclined to rule broadly that the framework used by Bakke and subsequent cases is no longer valid, either because the educational benefits of diversity are too difficult to define or achieve, or because those benefits are not sufficiently compelling to warrant explicitly taking account of race in higher education admissions. Some justices appeared inclined to rule more narrowly that just Harvard and UNC's admissions programs fail to meet the requirements of Fisher II and other earlier cases. But it did appear that a majority of the justices on the court are prepared to say that affirmative action should end, and that race-based affirmative action is no longer constitutionally permissible. Yeah, please.
And we've been kind of referring to these, and they're often referred to in the press as admissions cases. But what's the full scope of the possible decisions and their consequences?
Well, I think that the justices were trying to puzzle that out at the argument in these cases. And I think that they are very concerned about the possible repercussions, not just in college admissions, but for campuses more broadly, and even honestly for all of American society, based on how they ultimately decide these cases. Questions fell into several broad categories. They wondered what types of things can be considered that are closely linked to race, but fall short of checking a box marking one's race. They asked what race-neutral alternatives would be permissible, especially if the purpose of those race-neutral alternatives is to achieve some kind of racial diversity. And they were very interested in what the potential repercussions would be for other institutions in society just because of a diminution in diversity on college campuses, such as for the military or other institutions. There were questions at the argument just about what would happen to actually other types of programs on campuses, such as affinity groups, affinity housing. Would these things be impacted? Do they affect whether or not the court should or shouldn't hold affirmative action unconstitutional or unlawful? So these are definitely questions that the court was grappling with, and we don't have, I think, nearly as much visibility into how they are ultimately going to resolve those exceptionally difficult questions that have really troubled the court since it first began considering these questions in Bakke many years ago.
So it's potentially not just a admissions case, but also a scholarships case, a affinity group case. We could have those implications for campus as well.
Yes, it could.
And before I bring in our campus experts, can you tell us, when do you think that we'll have a decision from the court in these two cases?
I would anticipate a decision in these cases would come in June of 2023. Possibly at the beginning of that month, but I wouldn't anticipate having them any sooner than that.
All right. Well, now I'd like to bring in all of our other experts from college campuses, both public and private. And I'd like to begin with a kind of a round robin with things that is really top of mind for you for your various vantage points on campus. And Matt, I'd like to start with you, since this is at its core an admissions case. What are you and your colleagues at the ASU admissions office having as your kind of top 2 or 3 things that you are thinking of as you prepare for the decision to come down in the late next spring or early summer?
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel today. So, I think if anything, this is a really good reminder of the opportunity to kind of continue to connect across campus, have meaningful discussion, having opportunity to hear different viewpoints, different sides of the story. And so we've spent a lot of time just kind of rediscovering each other, actually, rediscovering what's priority. At Arizona State, we are a little bit unique in the fact that we actually have had a proposition, a voter proposition in 2010 that actually banned the use of race in admissions, Proposition 107. And so the impact is not as great at ASU as it might be at some of the other institutions nationally, but it's been a great opportunity to continue to have those conversations. What is our priority? What is important to us? You know, our charter at ASU says, includes a statement of, we are measured not by whom we exclude, but by who we include and how they succeed. And this is just kind of a great touch point to ensure that we are providing excellence and access in education to all our students, that we are ensuring that our outreach opportunities are robust. It's a great way to go back and measure the successes we've had or the challenges that we have not been able to overcome. And so it's been a good opportunity to kind of re-energize those discussions and find kind of the common ground again.
Yeah, Wanda, I would like to bring you in next. So, whatever the court decides is going to be, you are the chief diversity officer and charged with, building confidence that whatever the court decides, that at your campus there can be a diverse and inclusive campus. So as you and your office prepare for the decisions, what's top of mind with you? Wanda, I think you're on mute.
Very sorry about that. Like a lot of my colleagues, I am very worried, but I'm also seeing this as an opportunity to actually double down on the things we need to do in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. One of the things I think that is real important is how we're going to be thinking about what are the other things that we need to do in terms of looking for legal ways as well as innovative and creative ways to diversify our campuses. And so CMU, even before I got here, was already working and looking at that. And one of the examples I want to make sure I put out there is around, we are part of a pilot program with the College Board. And with the College Board, they're using a tool that's called Landscape. And that Landscape tool is focusing on neighborhoods and high schools and is not looking at race. But in those neighborhoods and high schools, is able to tell us where there are challenges that are happening, where folks are dealing with financial barriers and other things, yet the students are still finding a way to be successful in college. And we want to know more about that. And we want to tackle those kinds of innovative and creative ways. So as a CDO, a Chief Diversity Officer, what I feel that's important, that the institution, along with my guidance and others, we need to go together. We need to go sometimes slow and sometimes we need to go fast, but we need to go together and we need to get very creative about what needs to happen. But I am happy to say that we are already and have been thinking about things like, what does our admission policy say right now? How are those things structured? How are we going to do outreach into certain kinds of communities? And the last thing I would say that is dear to me is I do have some concerns in terms of how we approach it and what we're saying as communicators. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be important that we frame all of this from an asset and not a deficit place. Mm-hmm. And that when we tell our narrative or tell our stories, I'm channeling Trebian Shoulders now in my thinking about asset framing. And it's going to be important that we share the story of how we go forward around DEI and B in a way that it is a good thing for all of us and not something as a deficit or a negative part of what we do in relationship to inclusive excellence.
Well, I appreciate both a very specific example of the landscape program, and I want to come back to the asset framing. But Frantz, I'd like to bring you in now. So you have in your title both undergraduate enrollment and campus life. I'm wondering what's top of mind for you and your staff as you get ready for these decisions.
So thank you for having me. And I will piggyback on sort of what Wanda talked about, because I do think for the institutions and for our mission, we really do need to stay focused on what's our mission, what's our overall mission. And when we think about our mission around the teaching, the learning, the scholarship and community, it's really to ask ourselves, what will be the implication of this for those different domain areas, whether we're talking about teaching, learning, scholarship and community. And I think tied to that, specifically are things around campus climate, culture, and community. This is where I see, the repercussions of this for a campus like mine that is very politically active and where our students are not shy to speak their mind at every turn on issues that are critical issues of our times. This will certainly be one of those issues that I think we can expect our students to speak loud and clearly about. And it is about what is the mission of institutions and what is specifically, how will this impact the kind of learning environment that we want to create for our students, but also the kind of learning environment that our faculty want to be part of, and our staff who are also educators. And so as I think about this, it is to ask ourselves the question, if part of our jobs is to prepare the next generation of leaders, who are those leaders for the future? And how does this impact that work? If our jobs is to not only look at diversity, but look at equity and inclusion, then what is the impact of this in terms of campus climate and culture? How will this impact that? I think that's a question that we will want to ask ourselves. So first and foremost, I think it's safe to say that for our students who are here, they're here with purpose in mind. There are the next generation of leaders that we want to prepare. But also faculty come to institutions because they believe in the critical mission of our institutions. So this is both about mission and mission critical. It is also about the type of community that we want to see. And then lastly, it is about how we hold ourselves accountable for truly preparing the next generation of leaders, not some leaders, but all leaders within our society. So that's a little bit of what comes to mind for me as I think about this. And Wanda, I think, spoke very well about it when she said, wherever we land, we need to look at this from an asset framework. This is going to be incredibly important because the last thing we want are students who are coming to us and who all of a sudden find themselves in environments where their existence is being questioned, where how they got here is getting questioned and is getting challenged. We've been there before and we can no longer go back there.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I want to start getting into some of the specifics about how these conversations will take place around inclusion and the question about place on campus. And I want to think about the conversations about the way the was argued in the court, what will be happening, and then decision day itself. And we saw with the Dobbs decision last June, how much energy there can be on a college campus, and Andrew suggested this decision too will come out very likely next June. Many students will be off campus for the summer, but some will be on campus. They'll all be on social media. There'll be faculty and students, or faculty and staff on campus, and this is going to be a decision where there are competing claims of justice on both sides. And there is fear and anxiety amongst supporters and opponents of the use of race on college campuses. And I just picked a couple quotes out from news stories that I'll just read. So someone who was a supporter of affirmative action was quoted as saying, affirmative action is overturned will not only impact incoming students, but also current students who may no longer see themselves among their fellow classmates. And an opponent of affirmative action, was interviewed, and he said, some people are going to be afraid of getting canceled. And it's not just students, but it's for faculty and staff and people raising questions about how even faculty who've been there for a long time, whether they were admitted and how they were admitted to college campuses. So we want college campuses to be models about these contentious issues. And as we look ahead to decision day and for decision day, what is it that all of you are thinking about in getting ready for this conversation, and how is it, or is it at all, that campuses should try to moderate these conversations? Fant, I'm going to ask you first.
Like everything else, you need to prepare for it. And preparation starts now. And part of that preparation is to engage your entire campus. And in engaging your entire campus, it's also recognizing that there will be multiple voices and there will not be agreement. As you very well mentioned, Jackie, there will be those who will be elated. There will be those who will be mourning and grieving.
And no matter what the case is, no matter how the case turns out.
No matter where it turns, we're going to have those who are grieving as well. And so part of that is creating spaces and holding spaces for it to happen. I often say that for me, in my role in campus life, and for the work that I do, is how we make sure that we bring people together and that we create those intentional spaces. We know that for our students, there are lots of different ways in which expression takes place. We certainly need to respect that, but we want to make sure that those conversations really, in many ways, are informed, because we're first and foremost educational institutions, and there'll be lots of different perspectives on it. So we need to leverage our knowledge, and we need to leverage the expertise that exists within our campus community, while at the same time making sure that we create intentional spaces for people to be heard, understood, and valued for the position that they bring.
Matt, how are you thinking about getting ready for decision day and the conversations running up to it?
I think there's a couple of things that I've spent some time thinking about, and one of them is we can easily make a lot of assumptions that there are people that really understand all of this. I certainly was not a part of the 70s case, but I've been in admissions, in all the other cases, and have had lots of discussions to it. But in our world of enrollment and admissions especially, there's a lot of younger staff and individuals that may not understand the complexity, as well as the fact that how universities go about their admissions varies widely. I mean, it's just as diverse as our country itself in terms of this. And so I think in many instances, I have the responsibility of framing it not only for my staff, but for other enrollment managers. I have the responsibility of, going kind of department by department especially at the graduate level, where they have a lot more autonomy and they have a lot more kind of individualized opportunity to make their decisions, to ensure that at least people have the facts and not bring any sort of bias or opinion. And kind of going about and really understanding that, I think to my fellow panelists' point, there is plenty of opportunity here, regardless of what the results are. There's plenty of opportunity for us to improve. There are lots of tools out there available to us. There's great opportunities for us to really assess what we're doing now that's race neutral, to see what's working and do we have any glimpses of opportunity. But I think the most important piece too, and probably the part that's the least fun, is we're spending a lot of time kind of going through and creating our inventory of programs and activities that may have potential or may be impacted in June when this is resulting. To the earlier point, preparation is key here. We still have time. I know some individuals feel kind of behind on their preparations. I do think we still have time. I also think it's important that whatever we decide to do is not performative, right? The last thing we want to do is make statements out there, jump the gun and make statements out there that ultimately we can't control the result of. And so there's lots of good conversation around that as well.
I think that inventory sounds like an important piece in this question of statements. I mean, university presidents and others issue statements about various topics, and I wonder if that will be something that campus leaders will be thinking about, just as many had statements about the Dobbs decision, if they'll be thinking about making a statement when these two decisions come out next June.
You know, if I may, Jackie, just sort of add to what my colleagues have said, and even your last comment. I mean, I know that I'm thinking about it, and and some of my other colleagues are absolutely thinking about it, which is how do we prepare our campus and faculty, staff, and students, alumni, parents, everyone. Everyone is a key stakeholder, I think, on a college campus, and so I'm really thinking about FAQs, thinking about webpage, thinking about speakers, thinking about, I liked absolutely when Matt mentioned around the professionals within his unit, division, and so forth. Not only do I think it as an opportunity where admission officers and recruiters may need a refresher, assuming maybe it doesn't get overturned, but let's go there for a moment. But a refresher about what they're doing, but also if it is struck down, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to do professional development and learning internally and externally. And then one of the things I'm also planning, I don't know about the other institutions here, but we have what we call D&I leaders or academic diversity officers in every college and every division. I am absolutely going to leverage their expertise and knowledge to get on the ground because people actually even now don't even understand affirmative action as it exists now. So that's going to be important. So that stands out. And then the last thing I would say to your question around, or just your thought around the statement piece, I don't know what format things will come in terms of how CMU will respond to this, but I still say that CMU and other institutions, that our students, faculty, and staff, as well as I said, alumni and so forth, they're looking for guidance from the leadership. And that's all of us, that from deans to vice provosts and vice presidents and the president. And some folks will use how the leadership and senior leadership respond as a pulse. And that's going to be important for us to think about what we say to our community.
Yeah, that sounds like an important piece. And I do want to, come back. We've talked some about students, but I want to come back to Matt's mentioning about the staff, and you're picking up on that too, Wanda, and all four of you may have thoughts about this. If the court does disallow race-conscious admissions and the use of race in admissions decisions, it may require staff to make changes to policies that they very passionately support. Inside Higher Ed recently published its 2022 survey of admissions officers, and they described, in their words, overwhelming or strong support for affirmative action, and particularly with regard to these two cases. Almost half of the admissions officers that they surveyed supported UNC and Harvard, and only 10% roughly supported the overturning of the use of race. So thinking about what is it that people who are VPs of admissions or others who are on the top of the president's cabinet, or others who are leading admissions teams, what do they have to do to get ready to work with staff, some of whom may be asked to make changes This is something that they really deeply support. And knowing that even amongst the admissions staff, this is something that's going to be felt very personally. And there are going to be people who are on both sides of the issue.
So, Jackie, just to chime in quickly, I would say it is the admission staff, but I would say it's actually staff in every part of our campus community, because the admission staff is clearly at the front line in terms of students who are coming in and the decisions that needs to be made there. But I would argue that it is that group, but it is also our residential life team, because we know where these conversations often tend to take place and where they tend to get heated. Is the spaces and places where students are often living and are having these interactions in more meaningful ways than that. It is your academic advisors who are also very passionate about these topics and who have come to our institutions with really an equity frame and an equity-based, sort of mindset as well. So I would just preface by saying it is certainly the admission team, but I would think it's really our staff across the board and frankly, faculty as well. The classroom becomes that place where these conversations take place. I just wanted to preface that, and then I'll let my colleagues chime in.
Andrew, I'd like to bring you back in because I know that you've talked about, what's it like to ask people to do something that they are required legally to do, but passionately feel the other way.
Yeah, there will be conversations that will have to take place between individuals at all levels of the university and their general counsel's office and their attorneys to set parameters for what can be said, taken into account. Reporting structures will need to probably be created for if there are incidental sort of transgressions or violations so that those can be reported to individuals who can assess sort of legal risk and compliance risk. It is going to create difficulties. There is no doubt about that, because it is obvious that a person that has a race and when they are being assessed as part of the admissions process, it will be very difficult for individuals to sort of put those aside. However, there are universities in certain states that have, of course, implemented programs like these under state law. And, people will want to look to those universities, see how they have addressed these things, sort of look for best practices. And that'll probably be the first step.
Well, thank you. I think that brings us to an audience question from Brian Kelly. And, this question about, what can we learn from states where this has already been required? And that's so far 9 states, beginning with California and Prop 209. And it's a really diverse range of states, red states like Nebraska, blue states like Washington State. So Brian Kelly asks, can you explain any state level policies that exist that allow for the promotion of racial diversity on campus that would not be invalidated by a SCOTUS ruling against affirmative actions or policy actions states might consider in the future to still promote diversity in schools in light of the ruling? So kind of functional equivalents that would be legal were the court to rule against Harvard and UNC.
Well, I feel like this brings it back to me just for a bit to frame the conversation insofar as this case, the oral arguments and the briefing make clear that the challenge is a narrow one to race as a factor explicitly in admissions. However, there are lots of race neutral means of achieving racial diversity and other kinds of diversity that are likely not going to be affected by this decision. In fact, the challengers themselves held out Texas's top 10% plan as an exemplary method of achieving racial diversity through a race neutral means. So there are going to be state policies. I imagine there will be more experimentation, both at a campus level and at a state policy level, to achieve many of the benefits of diversity without the explicit reliance on an individual's race. And that seems to be what we might be looking at following this decision.
Matt, are you getting calls from your colleagues from the other 41 states where this isn't yet a requirement?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, in the admissions world, this has been a discussion that's happened for many, many years. I think in most cases, you know, we know what's ahead of us. Many of us have already, to my colleagues' points, have already thought through. We're already using tools. You know, I mean, let's be real. Although we've seen great strides over the many decades, we still have a lot of work to do. And certainly the pandemic and other challenges that our world has seen recently has caused even greater challenges. So if anything, this is just maybe a little bit more gasoline on my spark to really find a community of not only admissions professionals, but university of dedicated university leaders across the country to really get after it. And I think, you know, I'm an optimist in this world. And I think you have to be in the world of university admission these days. And I'm excited to see what creativity comes out of this. You know, I think our greatest challenge in higher education is we've never been good at communicating our value, our purpose in society. And now here's another opportunity for us to come together and really frame the importance for society, the importance of higher education for all. And so, yeah, we've had to go back to your conversation. We've had a lot of conversations. Many enrollment managers participate in College Board and ACT where this is discussed widely. I think we have to get out to high schools and high school counselors and high school leadership so that they can understand it. We have to get to our CBO partners so that they can understand it. You know, we essentially have the next 6 months or so to really get after that.
Yeah, and in terms of that creative thinking, we have a question from Mitchell Kalb. I'd like to hear more about asset framing. So Wanda, that was your term, and Fanta, you picked it up. Wanda, I'd like to hear more from you about what it means to have not a deficit framing, but asset framing.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'm channeling a entrepreneur genius, author Travian Shorter, who talks about asset framing in terms of very specifically around, or started off in terms of Black men, and really sort of looking at creating a different narrative, not starting in a place where you start talking about all the deficits that one person might have. This person is unemployed drug addict who happens to be such and such, as opposed to, and this person is graduating with their master's, and so the introduction of who they are starts off with all this sort of the challenges about their life and who they are, rather than the part of the narrative that is about their success and who they really are. And so thinking about this in terms of this particular situation, and thinking about historically how we've been socialized to as well think about affirmative action or these kinds of situation of race conscious admissions, is that you hear folks talk about it in a negative way, or a deficit, or that they've cost them something or lost something, and that something is being taken away. That certainly is just not true. And so part of what I'm proposing, as we think about the fact that if this gets struck down, if race conscious admissions get struck down, that as we try and take care of our community, as we try and take care of our members who have suffered from this kind of disadvantage of description of who they are, that it will be important for us to adapt a way of really talking about how these individuals and everyone else is valued, and that they belong on our campus communities, and that they worked hard to get here, and then at times harder than anybody else to get here for lots of reasons. So anyways, look up Travion, you'll discover a lot, but the overarching idea is we need to go at this as in a positive way. We reap what we sow. So part of what we want to reap is something good.
Fanta, I saw you nodding away, and you had picked up on this asset framing before. What would you add?
What I will add to this is a bit of what Matt talked about and Wanda as well. One of the things that we should not forget is that, on this journey that we've been in, there's still, as Matt said, a lot of work to be done. And the work that needs to be done is structural work that needs to happen. And it has to do with what and how do our institutions facilitate not only access, but really completion rate of students who come to our institutions, right? That is still work that has yet to be done. We still have ways to go in relations to that. The other part of this as well is we need to understand what are all the barriers, what are all the structural barriers for institutions that have been doing this work and that are committed to diversity, to equity and inclusion. We know that there's much more work to be done. And so with this decision, or wherever the decision lands, the work has yet to continue. And I think for those of us who've been on this journey, we know that we need to double down, because the structural issues will remain what they are. And how we, in many ways, remove those barriers is really key to how we really increase access for all of our students. So whether it's our work with community-based organizations, it is the financial aid that allows students to come in from socioeconomic backgrounds where they haven't been afforded the same opportunities, the kind of learning environments that we create for all of those things become really very important. Lastly, the truth of the matter is, for our students who are here, they've earned their places here. And that is something we cannot forget, because often the conversation tends to go in the direction of, well, maybe if things were different, they wouldn't be here. That is not the case. We have incredibly gifted students across our nations. And often I'm reminded of the fact that, talent is universal, but opportunity is not. This is about how we create more equitable opportunities for all of our students and our young people.
Yeah, and I want to bring in the faculty piece of this. We've touched on briefly because we've talked quite a bit about staff. We've talked a bit about students. Taylor W. has a question. What impact will the Supreme Court's decision have on faculty in the classroom? How can administrators assist faculty in navigating the potential abolition of race-conscious admissions? Wanda, I know that you've worked with a lot of faculty, both at Vermont and at Carnegie Mellon. What are you thinking about when you speak with faculty and helping them feel supported as this decision comes down?
Yeah, there are a number of things that are coming. I'm thinking about the faculty who might be members or identify as BIPOC or Black, African American, Latinx, and so forth, and what they may be feeling, and how they're trying to help their students through certain situations, and how they may cause them to be sort of reflective, but may also come up with emotions around that. And so I think everything that we're proposing and thinking about what we need to do for students, we need to do for faculty and staff. We need to be able to create spaces where they can together collectively and individually explore their feelings around it, but they also need to also be a part of helping to create innovative ways to helping us to move forward. And I also think it's important that we lift up our faculty in terms of who they are, superstars, and again, deserving to be here. So I think it's important that we make sure that our students, faculty, staff, alumni, other faculty, alumni, parents, and so forth know that we value our faculty. The other way I was also thinking about this too if there was some thinking about what's happening in the classroom and so forth. And, I continue to think about professional development and learning and what it means to do curriculum transformation, what it means to offer up various ways of thinking about our awareness and social and historical context of, being exclusionary. And so I think that shouldn't change. And those are the kind of things that should be happening in the classroom, and so forth. And if I may take a chance to say a third thing that kind of wraps back around to what Fanta was saying is, there's this aspect that I certainly believe in diversity, and we want to have those multiple voices at the table, but there's this piece around equity that gets left on the table. And I think we need to double down more around equity and that equity lens, because if we're focusing around that and we're, having awareness and thinking about policies, practices, and procedures and behaviors, my hope is that it will change some things that will make it more effective and efficient and fair for folks who have been left out in the past to actually move forward. So if we're reviewing those policies, practice, and procedures with that equity lens, it's going to impact diversity anyway. So I wanted to kind of go back to that as well.
That's a optimistic tone of ways in which we can think about this. Others on faculty, before I turn to a question that's come in, especially for Andrew Tutt.
The other part of this, Jackie, going back to the faculty, are also faculty who are in subject areas that we already know right now are in the bullseyes, right? Who is deemed controversial, and there's a lot of sort of external pressure related to that. So imagine bringing this additional layer and what that would mean for our faculty who have expertise in certain domains that are already under scrutiny. I think it's something we need to think about and figure out how we provide additional support. And then lastly, it goes back to what was spoken about earlier, which is our values. What are our values? Our ability to attract top-notch faculty, our faculty who are coming who are mission-driven. And so our ability to really speak to how this fits in within our value propositions as institution is going to be incredibly important, particularly as you're trying to attract new and junior faculty to come to your institutions. They will be looking out for those things. They will be looking for what are some of the guideposts and what are some of the signals that we're still very committed to equity, that we're very committed to multiple and diverse voices, and that we're committed to inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. The academic freedom and equity and inclusion piece, along with the student expressive piece. Andrew, there's a question for you from Zachary Batosh. I'm curious about whether Mr. Tutt or other experts follow on litigation challenges some of the alternative ways of diversifying the student body, like the 10% rule, assuming Grutter is overruled, and whether institutions have thought about ways to prepare or avoid that sort of litigation.
Yeah. So I think that the court's opinion will tell us quite a bit about whether we can expect that other means that are really diversifying in terms of their ability to bring underrepresented minorities to college campuses, whether those are going to be generally permitted and in a broad-based way, given a great deal of latitude by the Supreme Court, or whether those are also going to be sort of seen with a skeptical eye. I would imagine that could appear in the majority opinion or in a concurring opinion that has enough votes to command the direction of the court. The court at oral argument appeared to welcome race-neutral alternatives that would enhance racial diversity as their primary purpose. That appeared to be something that the court would be ready to embrace as something that would be broadly permissible. Obviously, these are questions that will be much more readily answered in the days and weeks after the opinion. Every university will want to consult with their general counsel, outside counsel. There is always follow-on litigation. That is an unfortunate fact about all of these kinds of things. But there will be parameters that I think this court is interested in giving bright lines, I'll say it that way, and that there will be parameters that universities will be able to follow that will put them on the right side of the line while still allowing them to achieve many of their diversity goals. Of course, it may not achieve all of them but it will still be able to get there without looking explicitly at race, which appeared to be the motivating, sort of the driving factor for the majority of the court.
So I want to come back to a concern that Matt raised about communicating the value proposition of higher education. We've talked about students, we're talking about faculty, staff. We are at a time of declining trust in institutions very broadly, and higher education is not exempt from that. A recent Pew survey found that only half of the general public said that colleges and universities are having a positive effect on the way things are going in this country, and almost 2 in 5 people said it has actually having a negative effect. And that shows up in all kinds of ways, whether it is education, action in state legislatures, or people wondering about whether or not their kids should really enroll in higher education. And this set of cases can potentially touch on those concerns, because it seems that there's a gap between the view of race-conscious admissions on college campuses, where they seem to have a lot of support, especially as reflected in the Inside Higher Ed Admissions Officers Survey, and the general public, where just to pick one poll, the Washington Post found that almost 2/3 of the general public said that race shouldn't have any place in college admissions. So for savvy college presidents and other college leaders who are thinking about this question of public trust, will the public's eyes be on colleges and universities as they respond to whatever the court's decisions may be, and how should college leaders think about addressing that gap between the most prevalent opinion on campus, where of course there's a diversity of views, and the most prevalent opinions against race in admissions among the general public, where there's also a diversity of views? Fonta, I'll start with you.
So, I think we will all agree that public trust in institutions of all types is certainly at an inflection point. But also some of that, Jackie, is fed by the narratives that are out there, right? So we know that there's definitely been narratives out there that are promoting that in all the ways that we can think about. Ultimately, I think the litmus test for all of us really rests around outcomes, and how we in many ways speak forcefully about the outcomes that are derived from higher education. Because once you start to do the homework and you start to dig deeper, it is still the case that when you think about from a social mobility perspective, when you think about work outcomes, when you think about income and so forth, and and wealth, it is still the case that higher education still holds tremendous value. That, I think, continues to be the case. We can't do that in 40 characters. It's not a Twitter that's going to do that. So we have to be more creative and more innovative about how we carry forward our message. But I do think the outcomes are there, and the outcomes still remain quite strong. Now, I think, as Matt said, we need to do a lot more work. And frankly, to be honest with you, I would suggest that we actually turn it over to this generation who can communicate differently to help us actually do a better job of how we get our message out there, frankly.
Matt, you were the one who raised this concern about communicating to the public. How is it that college campuses address this perception gap, perhaps over this issue, and rebuild trust?
Yeah, I think there are some important regional and kind of state differences as well, but with that being said, I think there's one thing to go out and make statements, right? But then there's another thing to Fonta's point of showing and giving stories of how it has been an important piece to our history. It has been a positive impact at the very kind of local community aspect, I mean, we have in our communities, within our universities, just amazing individuals who just hearing their stories highlights the power of higher education. And I think people really relate. People can relate one-to-one when they hear those stories. People understand overcoming challenges and things of that sort. But what they don't understand is how maybe affirmative action and this idea connects to some of those areas. So we just have to do a much better job of, I mean, we've never really invested in kind of explaining what we are and who we are. And we have a long history of sitting on top of the hill and looking down at people, right? And so, I mean, we created much of the challenges we have. And so I think to kind of close that out as well is we have to recognize that we created a lot of the systems that are being challenged today. We've created some of the things that have prevented people from having access to education. We have to own it. We have to show our communities that we do own it and we are moving forward in productive and hopefully positive ways. And we have to be very clear on what that looks like.
Matt, I think that's a wonderful call to action and call for us on which to end our hour together. So I really want to say, Andrew, Matt, Fanta, Wanda, thank you so much for bringing your expertise to us today and all of your insights. And I want to thank all our audience very much for tuning in today. We are just approaching the last very busy weeks of the semester. So I want to wish all of you on college campuses, from all of us here at BPC, just the very best for these last busy weeks of the semester. And for everyone on this webinar today, I want to wish you all a very joyous Thanksgiving next week. I'd like to invite you to follow us on BPC's YouTube channel and to learn more about BPC's Campus Free Expression project at our website, bipartisanpolicy.org, subscribing to our newspaper, and exploring our other programs at BPC and Campus Free Expression and in our other issue areas. So thanks very much and have a good day. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Shakti.